Thank you so much, Dr. Tibbitts, for your opening remarks. And it's my greatest honor to introduce and welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Phill Gittins. Dr. Phill Gittins is the Education Director of World Beyond War, a Rotary Peace Fellow, CASI Fellow, and Rotary Positive Peace Activator. He has more than 20 years programming, analysis, and leadership experience in the areas of peace, education, psychotherapy, and youth and community development. In the next 20 minutes, Dr. Gittins is going to lead us to explore the intersection of youth, peace, and human rights. By drawing on his extensive experience of partnering with youth in the practice of peace research, education, and action, let's welcome Dr. Phill Gittins.
Still, and thank you so much. Hopefully you can see the screen, everybody. If so, if you could all put the thumbs up, that would be wonderful. Perfect. Just before starting, a couple of things that would be wonderful. I've just been looking in the chat, the kind of people that are with us. If you can take 2 seconds to kind of write your name and where you're joining us from, because I think we've got a really nice international bunch with us today. So I was looking that there's Bulgaria, Argentina, Japan, US, UK, Venezuela. So we'd really love to get to know a little bit more about who's with us. So thank you so much. And thank you so much, Crystal, for the wonderful introduction. So my task in the next 20 minutes is to look at the intersection between youth, peace, and human rights. And I've kind of used this title, Beyond Participation, and I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that shortly. More specifically, before starting, big shout out to these 3 wonderful people. Thank you so much to the Human Rights Education Association for the invitation, for your leadership, for the great work that you're doing. And in particular, thank you to Crystal, Felisa, and also Jesse for putting this all together. Congratulations. Hat goes off to you. Thank you so much. So specifically, here's a broad sketch of where we want to go to in the next 20 minutes. We'll say something a little bit more broadly about, let's say, the why, the context, the interconnections between human rights, peace, and youth, and hopefully that will open the space up for a more in-depth discussion or a reflection on some projects that we're working on that looks to engage young people and move beyond participation or move beyond traditional participation. I'm going to say something about that shortly. One of them in particular, and I know we've got some people on the call here that are involved in this project, is a large project with the Rotary Action Group for Peace and Rotarians around the world and World Beyond War, which it's an ambitious project, and it's looking at engaging 13 partner countries and taking young people through processes of peace education, action, advocacy, etc. So that's where we're going to. Here's a good starting place, an argument, and which has pretty much informed much of my work and the wonderful colleagues that I'm very fortunate to work with over the years. And I've added in the bit here because we're obviously focusing on human rights today, that equipping young people with the tools, support, and networks to realize their rights and meaningfully participate in peace and security efforts, I think is one of the largest, most global and important challenges facing humanity today. So in the duration of the presentation, hopefully we can give some reasons for why we think that is and what can be done to try and work towards this goal or this challenge. So let's start with some context, the why, which I think is always the best place to start. Before looking at human rights and peace and youth, I think it's useful thinking about what many argue could be seen as the biggest challenge to peace and the biggest violation of human rights, and that is the war system. Of course, I'm here with my World Beyond War hat on. I think war and preparation for war is the biggest threat to peace and security, and actually to the environmental crisis as well. And there's a couple of reasons for that. If we look more broadly, 14 trillion plus was spent on economic containment of violence around the world. 2 trillion is spent on preparing for war. When you put that into perspective, although it needs updating, I think from the UN, some statistics have suggested that it would probably cost about 30 billion to end starvation on the planet and hunger. So in full, without quoting all of these statistics, we're preparing a lot more for war and war preparation than we are for peace. Peace does not just save lives, it's also good for livelihoods as well. So we need to actually transfer the money, particularly now in terms of COVID, when everybody's struggling, every country around the world in terms of responding to this. How can we transfer money from the war system to more productive activities such as education and health, which is actually a fraction of what we spend on preparing for war? Two existential crises that we're facing right now, not COVID. Two existential crises are nuclear weapons and climate change. Both of those two have clear linkages with the war system. It's easier to understand the linkage with nuclear weapons. Not so many know the linkages with the climate crisis. The US military is the biggest polluter on the planet. The US military is also the biggest user of fossil fuels on the planet as well. So if we want to make progress on climate change, we have to address the war system. So there's a bit of a broader context in terms of war. Let's move on to human rights, which really, broadly speaking, and again, the Human Rights Education Association, particularly Felisa with her great work, a much better place to talk about this than me, but we can make an argument that human rights are really the foundation of peace. They're really the foundation of progressive societies also. More so recently, and of course, we've had the Universal Declaration for Human Rights for 75 plus years. More recently, I think we can see that the Sustainable Development Goals is our generational approach to trying to realize human rights. So we can see that there's a clear kind of connection, human rights and peace. And of course, if you go back to the UN Charter, you've got human rights there, peace and security and development. Talking about the interconnections between peace and development, it's now widely recognized that we can't work on one without the other. There can be no sustainable development without peace. There can be no peace without sustainable development. So although the goal of 16 is a standalone goal, it's a cross-cutting goal. So if we want to make progress on education, on all the other goals, we need to really look at the issue of peace. The good news is this has been recognized at the policy level. And the other thing that's been recognized is that peace is not just done by people in elite level, sitting in the UN, etc., which have an important role to play. But I think we've seen over the years the democratization of peace, or at least on paper, which basically talks about, as Johan Galt and others have said, everybody has a role to play in peace building. Everybody has a task to play. So we've seen shifts in the peace building field from the global to the local. It focuses around the everyday focus, the lived experience, the indigenous approaches, local approaches, etc., which is more of a call, and again, related to participation, that everybody has a role to play in peace building. So hopefully this builds a bit of a context. Thinking about human rights, thinking about peace, thinking about development, there is no viable approach to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and related objectives around sustaining peace, youth, peace and security, women, peace and security, that does not involve the meaningful participation of young people in these efforts. So that's a good thing. So we know that. And Gandhi, or even before Gandhi, for a long time have spoke about, if we want to achieve real peace in the world, we have to begin with young people. So we've known that philosophically. The interesting thing is that I think now we have an unprecedented level of interest with regards to working with young people. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, now we have the most amount of young people on the planet than ever before in the whole of history. So what an opportunity to mobilize these young people. We now have 3 groundbreaking resolutions from the UN, which talks about the important role that young people should be playing in peace. So as you see here, some numbers, 3 billion, nearly half of the world's population. Of course, if we fail to include this amount of young people in processes to work towards peace, then we'll fail to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's the interesting news. So we've made great progress on policy, but as with a lot of things, there's often a gaps between what is said on paper, discourse, policy, versus what happens on the ground, you know, the practice, etc. So, and this has been recognized more recently, a great report from UN mandated, the missing piece. Young people are still missing, largely with regards to peace building work, noting wonderful exceptions that are being played out in many different parts of the world. But overall, an observation is the young people tend to be missed out. with that in mind, here's an opportunity to try and focus on the participation part. So when we think about youth, human rights, peace, we know that the human rights lay out very, very clearly that people have a right to participate in decisions that affect their lives. So what I want to do now is try and connect to peace education, action, advocacy, and research. When we look at education, we know, as per the Declaration of Human Rights, that education is a human right. There's now the argument that peace, or it's been about for some time, is a right as well. And also others within the field, I'm sure Felisa as well, among others, have made arguments that peace education, you know, and should be a right as well. And there's great work being done by this UN, is particularly target 4.7, which in broad terms could be defined as peace education, education for sustainable development, education for global citizenship, etc. So there's some great work. So part of mobilizing or including young people meaningfully, I think education has a role to play. It's necessary, but perhaps not sufficient. So necessary in the sense that people need to learn the knowledge, skills, tools, the values, etc., to engage, but then they also have to engage in other things. So I think it's really useful when we look at research more broadly in social science. A lot of research, too much research, is done about people. And when we think about young people, it's done about them. It's done for them, you know, more generally. That's why I'm looking forward to Felisa's research, which I'm sure is a great bit of research. So I think we could look at trying to support young people to exercise their right to research. So to become researched themselves, so rather than being researched on, you know, how do they get the training to do research and do the research themselves in collaboration with others? Because I think one thing about peace building is that we can make the arguments for peace building to be youth-led, and at the same time, let's not forget about the older people like myself. I'll speak for myself in terms of intergenerational collaboration. There's so much, I will speak for myself, that I learn from working with the wonderful young people that I work with day in, day out. I learn so much. Hopefully, in return, through working with these young people, they might learn a little bit as well. So it's about exchange, it's about collaboration. That's what peace building is about: negotiation, communication, learning together. So exercising the right to research. Of course, there should be opportunities for young people to take what they're learning from school, from university, etc., to try and apply what they're learning, to make sense of it. I mean, if you think of Columbia University, you know, John Dewey always spoke about the importance of learning through reflection. You know, so how can we provide opportunities for young people to think of, to get involved with action and HREA, you know, reflection and action, how to merge the both? It's very, very important to make a difference personally and also at the peace building level. And then also more broadly, how can we provide opportunities for young people to widen the sphere of influence, to communicate the outputs of their work that they're doing to donors, to policymakers, to practitioner communities, to the research community, etc. So there's some of the things that I've been thinking about over these years to try and help contribute to or address some of these questions. But of course, the question is, having looked at the why, and I think I've got about 10 minutes now, maybe. How do we do this? How do we do this? So here's a model that we've been using over the years to try and put people, particularly young people, at the center of peace building work in a way. And there's a focus on action research, which talks about first person, second person, third person research. So first person is really the researcher doing the work themselves, looking at their own role in this process. And then you move out, so you might use education, research, action, advocacy work, but then you move out to engage the community in this work, etc., to help craft the questions, ideally, if you're working from an action research point of view, to be involved with the research. And then culminate in the broader kind of outer circle is informing the practitioner scholarly community. So there's a model. There's a model that we've been using. I think in terms of time, I won't go into this, but it's about engaging research, education, action, and advocacy, because I'm aware of the time, so I'll move through that. But I want to spend the last bit of time talking about one particular project which we're working on, which tries to connect these areas of research, education, action, and advocacy. So this is the kind of the what will we do? But before doing that, and I know Annie and perhaps some others from the World Beyond War Youth Network, they'd shout at me if I don't mention this, but we have a wonderful World Beyond War Youth Network. If people are interested in it, it's made up of young people from all different places around the world. Please reach out to us. Please reach out to Annie. Annie's doing a wonderful job of leading this. When we put it together, the idea that the youth network would be co-created by, with, and for the young people. And they're definitely doing it. Like Crystal, like Jesse, others have put this together. The young people of the World Beyond War Youth Network are running. They're running. You know, they're doing such an amazing job. The second one, perhaps Felisa, when you and I connect, we can talk about this, is we're putting a project together with universities, housed at the University of Cambridge, and we're looking at developing the youth as scholar activists and putting together a network. But so if we could talk about that another time, but it's a very exciting project, UK, Kenya, Colombia as kind of the first starting project. And it's really focused around more the participatory action research. But here's the project that I want to focus on: Peace Education and Action for Impact. This is a project that will be starting on the 6th of September, and really evolves around two parts: peace education and peace action. It's a collaboration between World Beyond War. We're a global grassroots organization with membership in 192 countries, and we've decided to partner with the Rotary Action for Peace. Rotary is the largest service organization in the world, 1.2 million members, and we've got an MOU in place with the Rotary Action Group for Peace. Let's begin with the end in mind, which I think is always a good place to start in terms of projects. Our ambition is to connect and support a new generation of peace builders, aka subjects and agents of change. What we mean by that, subjects, is turning them inwards, and real peace education, real peace building should be about transforming the individual, but then agents of change, how do we try and influence change more broadly beyond ourselves, etc. Here's the model. So I'll say about this very, very quickly, but the idea is that we're bringing together 12, actually 13 now, country project teams. And the countries that will be involved, and people on the call maybe, there's US and you can apply, and there's the funding already there. Cameroon, Kenya, Nigeria, South Sudan, Serbia, Turkey, UK, maybe with Russia, we're in conversations as a joint team. Wales, which where I'm close to, US, Canada, Colombia, and Venezuela. Bringing these together, each country will have a country project team, 2 coordinators, which have strategic leadership, 2 mentors who work with young people through the process, and 10 young people, 18 to 35, to go through the process. It's a 14-week process, 6 weeks of peace education, and 8 weeks of peace action. The idea, if we start on the left-hand side, we can see that young people are typically objects, or too often objects. We want to try and move towards, and that means the power over relationships. We want to try and move towards kind of seeing them as subjects of change, doing work with them, by them, etc., and to move towards more kind of power with relationships. Because I think power, really, peace building, if you look at it, one way of looking at peace building is how do we move from triangular relationships of power over to circular relationships of power with. It's one way of looking, or one way I'd look at it anyway. So there's a little bit about the project. I'm going to go through this very, very quick, but it involves 2 parts. One, peace education, the other, peace action. The idea is to work with and take young people through this developmental process. The 6 weeks, it will be online. And here's one way of thinking about education. Really, if you think about education, we should be looking at the human experience, and the human experience is not just the head. We're not just the brain on a stick. We want to try and engage the whole person. So this is the conceptual, the thoughts, the thinking, etc., the concepts. But also, my background is counseling and psychotherapy. But how do we be in relationship with ourselves? How do we be in relationship with others? So this is the emotional intelligence, the relational intelligence. And so that could be the being side, which I think is the most difficult, and of course the most ongoing. We're always in a process of being and becoming. And then finally, the practical part. How do we use our hands, to kind of engaging these projects? So it's split up. The 6 weeks is split up in 2 weeks of the head, looking at theories, concepts, ideas, the conceptual part. 2 weeks of the attributes of being a peace builder, and then 2 weeks of kind of how do I design a peace project, etc. I'll skip through this very, very quickly, but I think I've said a little bit about that. So thinking critically, engaging compassionately, and organizing collectively is one way of doing it. So engaging the head, the heart, the hands. After the 6 weeks, they move on to peace action. So they work with their mentors, remember the country project team, to actually design, implement, and evaluate projects in their communities. So the impact will be individual impact on the young people going through the program, but also the young people will put together projects which will be implemented in their communities. And then the idea is that at the end of the project, after doing the projects, they would then have an end of community celebration. So this is the advocacy part. And the wonderful thing, because we've done this many times before in Colombia, Argentina, Bolivia, where I am now, etc., is that the young people have a platform to present their work for peace. And the other thing that I really love about this is that the parents are generally there to see the great work, which I think is a wonderful thing. We've done one project in Argentina where it culminated in 2 celebrations, and there was 800, 300 the first time, 500 the second. The mayor was there, the head of the education system. So this is the ambitious goal that we're setting. One other thing to mention about the project is that it's a community of practice. So as the young people will go through their projects, for example, Annie, you're going to hear from shortly from Venezuela, they will present their ongoing work and test their ideas. Meanwhile, South Sudan will listen and think, oh, it's a great project that Annie and the team are doing in Venezuela. Maybe that might give us some ideas for us. A real opportunity for intergenerational cross-cultural learning and collaboration, which I think is really kind of innovative, within the area, I think. I think I'll skip through this in terms of the time. I think I've said something in terms of the impact. So impact on the individual level, the people going through the program, impact on the community level in terms of the projects. And then more broadly, the idea is hopefully to influence policy and practice. There we go. I know I went through that very, very quickly. I want to say a massive, massive, massive thank you. And I'm going to come off the screen here. And I wanted to be very cautious of the time. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening. And lovely to see you all and looking forward to any questions. I do notice that there are some people that are going to be working with us on the program. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gittins. It's so, I'm so grateful to have you in this webinar, and your work is so inspiring. I already saw a lot of comments and questions popping up in the chat box, and we'll have a Q&A session and open discussion after the presentations. So for now, we're moving on to another exciting presentation by Dr. Felisa Tibbitts. So I'm going to introduce her. Dr. Felisa Tibbitts is a co-founder and executive director of HREA and UNESCO chair in human rights and higher education. Dr. Tibbitts is also a professor and chair in human rights education in the Department of Law, Economics, and Governance at Utrecht University, and a lecturer in the International Educational Development Program at Teachers College, Columbia University. In her 10 minutes presentation today, she will be sharing the initial results of a qualitative study of youth activists in the U.S. and youth engagement in social change efforts in this context. So welcome back, Dr. Tibbitts.
Thank you, Crystal, and thank you, Phil, for your really inspiring presentation. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A session so we can have more of a discussion. I know some people here in the webinar will have you questions about your work and how they can engage with it. Me too. So everyone, I'm very pleased. This is actually the first time I'll be presenting on some of this research that's been being carried out for the last 2 years. And I apologize in advance that my PowerPoint slides are a little uninspired, but I literally just pulled them together for this webinar. Let me share my screen now, though, and tell you a little bit about the background for this study. So let me go to, all right, can everybody see my screen? Yes, okay, let me fix it so it looks a little better here. Slideshow, here we go. The inspiration for this study is was the work of, I'm trying to move my slide up, people like Greta Thunberg. It was obvious a few years ago that youth were taking the lead, especially in the United States, around issues like climate change or banning assault weapons. And there wasn't a lot of research that I saw around what was motivating them. And moreover, because I work in Teachers College at Columbia University, I was especially interested to know if and how any of their efforts in taking action were influenced by things that they either learned or experienced in the school setting. In today's presentation, I'm not going to be focusing on the school influence. I'm just going to be focusing on youth's ideas about their activism, what motivates them, how they think they're contributing to social change. It's just a piece of the research. I want to begin with an inspiring quote. I began by planning to interview around a dozen youth activists and got so inspired by them and intrigued by what was motivating them that we continued to do the research for another year and ended up with 28 very in-depth interviews. So that you can see this wonderful quote from this youth activist. The last thing I want to say is that young people are amazing. They do this out of care for others. You can see the love that shines from the people I work with. And that certainly was very true for the people that were interviewed. There was so much a sense of care and caretaking for others that was motivating them. I really appreciated your presentation, Phil, on how you're using action research with the youth. This was a more traditional study insofar as we did come up with an interview protocol. There were a couple of us doing interviews, so we wanted to have that consistency. And I'm also thinking that we might try to extend this research into other countries. Perhaps some of the feedback you give me today would either encourage me or discourage me from doing that. But we did recognize that youth voice was essential. So we did have an interview protocol, but it was all open-ended. So basically we'd have hour and a half, really conversations with youth about their work. So this work, the research was carried out by myself and Marissa Wong, who's now a graduate of Teachers College. And she has been helping me with the analysis and with some assistance also from a Columbia University undergraduate, Louis Gasca. So the first question, the research question, is one that I'll be presenting briefly on today. And they were youth that were interviewed. They were between the ages of 18 to 23. They had attended university, or rather, sorry, they had attended high school in the United States, but they were no longer in high school. They were at this point post-high school. Most of them were in college. I want to do a little bit of a background briefly on conceptions of good citizenship. There's a lot of literature around good citizenship and conceptions about what it means to be a good citizen. Westheimer and Kahn are two of the theorists who have worked together to help identify one kind of good citizenship called the justice-oriented citizen. This is actually fairly recent. There was a time when good citizenship was understood as being, obeying the laws, paying your taxes, maybe donating to philanthropic causes, but you can see them. We've got three ideas right here. And the last one, justice-oriented citizen, is really related to youth activism and social change work. But this area has been, I think, a little bit underdeveloped. And what we wanted to do in this research is really understand how youth were understanding their own work in activism. Sorry for all the text here. This happens when this is the first time I'm presenting. Just want to say in terms of methodology that we began by just reaching out to young people I knew who were activists, then looking for clubs, youth organizations at Columbia University, that were either political or social action oriented, and interviewed some of those students. But then from their recommendations went on to interview other young people who had been activists during high school. We transcribed all the interviews, we coded them. It's been a lot of work. It's been a lot of fun. A little bit on the demographics. We see here a background of the 28 that we interviewed, what it looks like in terms of gender, female, male, they, or those identifying as she, they, but majority being female. Ethnicity, we had in the end a quite interesting and diverse group, I think. We have here representation from Asian, Black, Latinx, white, and even Middle Eastern communities in the States. You can see the numbers here. About a third of those we interviewed spoke a language other than English at home. So there was diversity here. Also, in terms of the schools they had attended in the United States, the kind of school, most of them had attended public school in the States. You can see in the graph here, some of those public schools had very specific identities, whether they were a charter school, a magnet school, or they did project-based learning or the arts, which turned out to be quite important for the part of the study that concerns influences in school. I'm not going to be presenting on that, but I will say a little teaser for that, that the kind of ways that learning was organized in school had, in some cases, quite a bit of influence on how youth were understanding their own points of view and their interest in trying to make change. We did have a few that attended private school. 2 of those were Christian religious schools. We did see here, we have here also some diversity. I know one of the questions that I've had in the past is if you began by interviewing Columbia University students, were they all from New York? And the answer is no. People that we interviewed ended up being from very different parts of the country, also very different kinds of sizes of towns and cities, so quite a bit of diversity here. So one of the questions we asked were, what were their social change goals? What were the issues that really motivated them? And a little piece of analysis that I can already tell you about is that we did find it looks like a pattern between some of the identity groups of the youth we interviewed and the issues they were interested in. For example, white females were much more likely to be interested in gender equity, reproductive rights, and prevention of sexual assault, whereas Black and Latinx youth were more interested in terms of patterns in working for racial justice, prison reform, or defunding the police, or just liberation. So here is the list of issues that were identified by youth. Many of them worked on multiple issues, typically not more than 2 or 3. I mean, it takes time to work for social change, and sometimes youth really had to be focused, or they might be spending a lot of time working on a certain issue, but had interest in more than one issue. So you can see here the wide range. I won't read them out to you. I did present them by a percentage in terms of how often they were showing up, in terms of people volunteering that these were the issues they were working on. Immigration, prison reform, climate crisis. These are also issues in the national discourse here in the United States. But you can see an incredibly wide range of issues that the youth are interested in. A very wide range, and some of them very deep systemic change kinds of issues like economic equity, economic justice, or liberation, for example. So this was a very, very interesting. We asked them if their areas of activism were linked with any ideology or framework of thinking. And I have to confess that part of my own interest in doing this research was to see if young people connected up what they were working on with human rights. And that was actually very rarely the case. In fact, less than half had a strong identification with any ideology. This was really, really interesting for us to see because we thought that there'd be a framework of some kind. There were some movements that some identified with, but basically what we saw is for those who had a link with any ideology or framework, it was either a political ideology like Marxism, human rights, democratic socialism, leftism, or social movements, sometimes ecofeminism, Afrofuturism, the Chicano movement. Sometimes it was a religious or cultural ideology like humanitarianism, Ubuntu, or a theology. But it was amazing that but the youth were very creative in generating their own ideas and issues. And I want to emphasize here that the youth activists that were studied, that were interviewed, were generally working within their own frames. They were working with other youth. They had identified issues of concern. They weren't necessarily part of a massive national coalition or organization. So it was very, very creative. And I think in the diversity we see in the issues that they worked on, and also the lack, in many cases, the lack of a link with a strong ideology really interestingly reflected this as well. In terms of strategies, we asked them to describe their social change goals and the wider strategies for achieving them. Again, a real breadth of strategies, which showed a great deal, I think, of savviness among youth activists. So some of them were, I have a few slides for this. Culture change was about 40% of those we interviewed were interested in culture change. So again, we're not thinking about typical activism just trying to influence governments, but deep culture change in society. I've got a couple examples of this. Many of them were very interested in education and awareness raising, and that was part of what they were doing as part of their activist work. And again, these are interlinked, right? Education and awareness for culture change, but we still coded them independently. Some talked about system change, ending the rules of corporations or achieving liberation. Providing support to others was also this interpersonal dimension, helping people who are suffering. And policy change, we do see it there, but only 21% even mentioned policy change, including education reform. Some were motivated by more more intrinsic kinds of goals. They talked about wanting to fulfill their responsibilities, to try to make the world a better place, or personal development. Although I'm sure they wouldn't, if we asked them directly, they probably wouldn't say I'm trying to improve myself, but many of them did talk about this as one of the results, that they were learning new ways of activism and personal development. We also asked for different kinds of tactics that youth were using to achieve their change goals. And here's the list of tactics. We have a lot of really wonderful detail on this, but you can see again, an incredible variety of tactics related to strategies, consciousness raising, grassroots organizing, economic transformation, voting, centering marginalized voices. These were young people we interviewed between the ages of 18 and 23 with an incredible, in my opinion, wisdom about the tactics needed to undertake strategies. So to Phil's wonderful presentation, I mean, the youth I interviewed, which are, I think, they're maybe typical for youth activists, if you will, have so much knowledge, so much understanding, and great experience on organizing. It's just so impressive. So again and again in the interviews, we were incredibly impressed by what youth were already doing and the thoughtfulness of behind their actions. So yes, more power to youth indeed. Skill sets, we asked them, what kinds of skills do you specifically feel that you're adding? Because the youth were identifying strategies, they were identifying tactics. When we asked them, well, what do you see yourself as giving to this change, the change movement you're involved in? And here we see, in summary, the kinds of skill sets that the youth identified that they were offering. A lot of it had to do with just communication and expression. Many of them were writing or doing public speaking, leadership of very different kinds of leadership, not just being in charge, but working as part of a team, delegation of tasks, and interacting with others. It was very interesting. This was a code we came up with, which tried to capture the fact that they were working closely to listen well, to facilitate, to understand different perspectives. It wasn't just a kind of just trying to get the message across and convince others of their own thinking. I have to wrap up now so we can get to Q&A, but we also asked youth how their activism had changed them. And I have a few quotes on this, just beautiful quotes. And by the way, all those that we interviewed did say that they anticipated in 5 years' time that they would still be engaged in youth change efforts. They were lifers, if you will. So these are longer quotes, and I'd like to invite actually the HREA folks to read these, to take the mic and read these out loud. Jessica, would you mind reading this quote, please?
Sure. I think that, like, when I was younger, doing well in school was really, really important to me. And like having the approval of adults in the room or like people in power was really important to me. And I think those things that have become a lot less important to me, and what's become important to me has just been doing the work that makes me feel better about the world, which is like almost never my math homework, and almost always like trying to talk about social issues and figuring out active ways to be involved in it.
Thank you, Jessica. And Serena, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to read the next one, and then we'll move to the Q&A session. Serena?
Sure. I think obviously activism changes everyone in a lot of ways, but I think the major fundamental change for me, like personally, is just my ability to take criticism and remain calm. I think part of the job of being a really good organizer is taking the criticism and input of a lot of really diverse and often conflictual people and trying to get them all to agree to work on an issue that we all care about and building those bridges. And I think through activism and also through like friendships with really conservative people and living in rural areas, I've just been able to become a more calm and measured person.
Thanks so much, Serena. Thanks very much for your attention. I'm sorry I went a little longer. So Jessica, are you going to be taking the floor now?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Tibbetts, and thanks for all of your research on youth leadership. And on the note of youth leadership, we have 3 youth leaders with us today, and I'm just going to briefly introduce them and then just pass the mic off to them, because in the spirit of having them lead, we're going to have them do just that in this webinar. We're going to have them take the mic over, and they're going to lead us through a Q&A session. So I'd like to introduce to you Sunny and Josh and Annie. And Sunny and Josh are joining us from South Korea. They participated and contributed to the Generation Human Rights Unmasking Pandemic curriculum last fall. And then we also have Annie, who is a youth leader in the WBW network. So I'd like to welcome the 3 of them to the floor, and I'm going to pass it off to them and let them give some brief introductions of themselves and their role as youth leaders. And then they're going to lead a Q&A for everybody, engaging Dr. Tibbetts and Dr. Gittins and the rest of our audience. So welcome, Sunny and Josh and Annie.
Thank you. Thank you for having us here. We are thrilled to be part of this panel. And I think we're going to introduce ourselves really quick and then ask really interesting questions for our speakers. So I'm Annie. I'm a 19-year-old Venezuelan student. I'm based in the U.S. I'm an alumni of Rotary Youth Programs for Young Leaders. I'm passionate about diplomacy and peace building, and that's why I got involved in War Beyond War as chapter member of the War Beyond War Youth Network, and I'm currently part of the board of War Beyond War. Sunny or Josh?
Yeah, hi, I'm Sunny. I'm a senior at Seoul International School. And because Ms. T offered this great opportunity to participate in the human rights education pandemic stories, unmasked pandemic stories, I got to participate in this webinar, and it has been such great presentation so far, and I'm so excited to see how the Q&A is gonna go.
And hi, I'm Joshua from Seoul International School also. I'm currently a junior here, and I am honored to be part of this amazing webinar. And yeah, let's just get into our Q&A. So I think Annie will ask the first question. So yeah.
Okay, we have a question for you too, and see if you can give us your answer. How was your childhood like in your teenage year, and how did you start this path of peace building? But how can you bring us back to your teenage years?
Felicia, do you want to go first? I think it's a great question.
Sure, I'll go first. Well, I actually grew up in a military family. And during the Cold War. So I grew up talking about the Soviet Union and nuclear weapons and weaponry through my whole childhood. And so I felt like I had a real awareness of war, and without being anti-military, I just felt like I didn't want war to be the way of the world. So as soon as that was the biggest influence on me, Annie, is growing up around war and war making and weapons making, and feeling like I needed to do something to counteract that discourse and that military industrial complex, as it used to be called.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. And what a great question, everybody. Thank you so much. Okay, I think it's a really, really important question, and actually it's one of the questions that on the course, the Peace Education Action for Impact, that we'll be looking at. Where are we in our developmental process of being and becoming peace builders? Because we're always in the process of being and becoming, right? And so in order to understand that, where do we come from, is a kind of connected question. So I think that's a really good question. I often think of myself, I'm sure like many others, as an accidental peace builder. It's not as if I finished school and thought, I'm going to be a peace builder. I didn't even know what the peace building field was, nothing. I worked as a youth worker, a therapist, a teacher trainer, etc. And then in probably about 12, 13 years ago, I took a year off and traveled through a lot of Southeast Asia and a lot of South America. And in doing so, I seen wonderful, wonderful things, wonderful, wonderful people, and also the legacy of violence, the legacy of war, ongoing conflicts. Come back to England and started reflecting, thinking, you know, what can I do with my kind of interests in youth work, community work, working with people to get involved with this kind of work. Never heard of the field peace building, never heard of peace and conflict studies, did what most people do, Google, and come across this field of peace education, peace building. Then, thank you, Rotary. Came across the Rotary Peace Fellowship, and also at the same time I was starting the PhD as well. And yeah, the rest is history. So, and I'm still in my process of being and becoming, you know, and trying to develop in the ways that I can, but very central to my work has always been, you know, working with and learning from so much. I was kind of like, you know, so powerful for listening to those quotes by the young people. They just like blow me away, how powerful. I feel so privileged to learn with and you know, learn from the young people. So that's a little bit of, you know, how I got involved with this kind of work.
I first want to start off by thanking Dr. Tibbitts and Dr. Gittins for such amazing presentations. I learned so much. This question, I got inspired by Dr. Gittins' presentation when you mentioned that there's like an unprecedented number of youth participation right now. So when like working with the youth, are there any difficulties, and how do you come to an agreement whenever there's disagreements?
That's a great question. Shall I go for that one, Felisa? Yeah. I think it's another really, really great question. And I think, you know, for the research that she's doing is really, really touching on that, and with Greta as a great example. I think there's wonderful activism, and perhaps an argument could be made more broadly that there's a lot of youth activism more towards the climate change than perhaps the youth activism with regards to the peace movement. And it's actually one of the courses that we've just put together with World Beyond War called War in the Environment. And part of the idea for that course is to try and get those in the climate change movement and those in the peace movement working together more effectively, because they can both push each other up and strengthen each other. When it comes to young people, we really need to learn more. And this is the great research that's just been shown, you know, in terms of we need to learn more from young people about what they're already doing, because they're already doing it. You know, they're at the forefront of this change. Both as the drivers of activism and the drivers of change, but also the frustration of being overlooked and excluded. You know, this is idea of the violence of exclusion. So we really need to kind of, the research I think is really good, that, you know, and I'd love to kind of, you know, follow up for Felisa, and then, because I think asking young people about their lived experiences is something we know a lot less about. You know, there's lots of research done about young people, but asking them what are their motivations, etc. What part of your question there was good in terms of the challenges. I think the challenges is how can we better co-create spaces, co-create together with young people, where we can both work with young people, learn with them, etc. And noting that there's a role for older people as well. I would say that it's about intergenerational work, and it's about going back to what peace building. Part of peace building can be at its core negotiation, communication. What good education is about, also communication. You know, working together, learning from each other. So how do we co-create those spaces where we can learn from each other and kind of prop each other up and support each other? I think that's one of the opportunities, whether you want to frame it as a challenge, an opportunity, I think that we have. That would be my kind of reflection.
Great. I don't have anything to add. I think it's good to get one more question in. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I actually have another question to ask to both of you, and especially as you guys especially target the younger generation and work with them. I was just wondering, like, what are your tips or like methods on bringing like together the generation as a whole, and also in other words, like, how do you promote intergenerational dialogue? Yeah.
Felicity, do you want to go that one?
I'm not working in youth organizing, so feel free, but maybe just briefly so we can move to the more open Q&A.
What I'd like to do there, if it's okay, if I'm not putting you too much on the spot, Annie, but you are, I learn a lot from you, and I find you very inspirational in terms of all the work that you're doing with Rotary, with World Beyond War Youth Network. Can you talk about the ideas that you have, along with all the other wonderful young people that are part of the World Beyond War Youth Network, and talk about your ideas of putting youth at the center, but doing so in intergenerational ways that encourage this intergenerational collaboration and learning. Is that okay, without putting you too much on the spot?
No, that's fine. I think one of the challenges that we have faced is that usually when older people, I don't want to say older people, but you know what I mean, adults are trying to work with youth, it's always let's educate them and let them do whatever, and it's not a collaborational situation there. So what we have learned, I think it's not just letting the youth do or not doing for the youth, but working together by mentorship. And I think mentorship is key, both in World Beyond War and Rotary. It was what has worked, working with them to create what you did for the youth network. For example, you brought the idea, brought the youth together, and you walk us through the path. You walk what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, but always letting us make the decisions that are going to affect us, but looking for advice. And I think mentorship is key about intergenerational collaboration, and honest conversation. We have different mindset, we have different points of view, and through conversations, I think that's key. Those two, conversations and mentorship. I don't know if that was accurate, but
yeah, I think it's great. I wouldn't add anything more. I think you've highlighted the important thing. It's not just about kind of letting, sometimes perhaps it is, but young people off they go, etc. It's about this kind of dialogue, so not a monologue, a dialogue, and having this discussion with young people and learning together. So thank you so much for what you shared. I totally agree.
Thank you so much, Sunny and Josh and Annie and Dr. Tibbitts and Dr. Gittins. We're going to transition to a new slide. We have a Jamboard set up here, and we would like to engage the entire audience in participating in answering some of the questions on here. We'd like to know more about your experiences and how you are engaging. And while you're taking the time to use the Jamboard as an audience, and if you're not familiar with how to do this, it's quite simple. You just grab a Post-it note and slide it over here onto the screen, and you can type on it, and it'll leave a message there for us. We'd like to hear from you as an audience, and while you're doing that, I'm going to engage Sunny and Josh and Annie in a couple of these questions themselves so they can respond for us. So Sunny and Josh and Annie, you can take turns. You don't have to all answer each of them, but just take turns maybe responding to one of the questions. So we'd like to know a little bit about Sunny or Josh or Annie, your experience in social change efforts. So if one of you would like to take that question, what are some of the experiences that you've had in relationship to social change efforts?
I'll start off. So actually, one of the things that I really wanted to kind of improve is the education in South Korea. I think it's kind of heavily leaned toward like private tutor institutions and not so much like school related. So I tried creating this mentor program at school. I'm just starting it, so I don't know how it's gonna go, but it was just basically to promote like interaction between the underclassmen and upperclassmen to kind of see how like self-motivated studying and self-directed studying can be more beneficial than receiving help from like other private tutor institutions. So that's one effort I'm trying to make, and yeah, I don't know how it's gonna go, but I'm trying to improve and kind of make education more toward students and not have students rely too heavily on external sources.
Awesome, thank you.
I also thought that like especially like in South Korea, it's actually hard for people, especially with disabilities, to actually like kind of blend into the society. And as I'm not sure if you guys know, but South Korea is like it's like a really online and digital related society. So especially for like the blind people or the deaf people, they can't really um like sometimes they're not aware of like these modern conflicts and how the world is like going on. So what I try to do was to create like a social media platform for these people with disabilities. And I actually like last month I actually focused on the deaf the blind people, where I actually tried to create a social media platform in your phone where you can actually um li- like um like you can listen to like these modern events while just pointing at these like buttons like related to topics. So yeah.
Wonderful. I think also I see people adding things to the Jamboard. In case you didn't catch it, the link is in the chat box. And I think we'll just get a quick response from Annie, and then we have to move on to our next part of the webinar. But Annie, I wanted to engage you really quickly to just respond to what led you to this path that you're on now as a student or as a youth leader?
I think it's because I was born in Venezuela at the beginning of the worst of the humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela is the second largest refugee crisis after Syria, and we are not even in war. So at the beginning of this crisis, you know, my generation had nothing to do with the decisions to let my country do it. But I was born in a bubble where everybody around me was trying to make it better, was trying to solve the problems, even when we were in a pretty bad situation. So I think that the challenge that I faced when I was younger, and the people that I was around that showed me the way on how to do it and give me the resources and the network and the knowledge on how to take lasting change.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your responses. And I see everybody adding things on the Jamboard now from the audience. We appreciate that so much and all of your engagement in that. I'm going to pass it over now to my colleague.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and all of our wonderful guests. I really wish we could have more time to continue the conversation, and I do believe that we would have more chances to do so in the future gatherings. So for now, I will invite you to visit HREA's online resource center with me. So I will share a tutorial on how to find the resources of your interest, how to use them for your needs, and how to submit your own resources to share with a wider community. Let me share my screen.
To celebrate International Youth Day, we put together a collection of resources to support human rights education for youth, with youth, and by youth. So here, I'm using some examples to give an overview of what we could offer. If you are a teacher or educator, you may find the first category more useful, where youth are basically the learners of your human rights lessons or the participants of your activities. If you are a young change maker yourself, like an activist or a peace builder, you may draw on the second category for your aspirations, because these materials are specifically designed for youth who are playing a leading role in human rights efforts, much more than just being educated by the teachers. The theme of this year is Transforming Food Systems, Youth Innovation for Human and Planetary Health. So we also include some resources on right to health, environment, and climate change in this collection, which are designed for particular groups of youth and human rights educators who work closely with them. Now follow me to explore this online repository, starting from the homepage of our website. First, go to the top, click on this button, Search Resource Center. You will have two options here, either by human rights theme or target group and strategy. Obviously, young population is a target group, so let's go to this one. Scrolling down to find out the keyword youth here, tick the box next to it, and we can see there are 37 results and 4 pages in total. Going all the way down to the bottom, you can have the access to the next page, which is labeled as older posts. Arriving at the third page, I'm going to look at an example of youth resource for teachers who want to use participatory methodologies. This is a facilitation manual developed by Amnesty International. You can use the URL to track the source, but we can ensure that the link has not been changed on the external website. So I recommend to use the file links below where you can access the material without having to leave HREA's resource center. Then you can download and save it to your computer for later use. For this one, we have 9 language versions. For example, if you need to use the French version, you just go to the right link to get it. Another example not only can be used by school teachers, but also is created for young leaders and peer educators to learn about and take actions for their own right to be protected from violence. Likewise, you can find the access to the original website where the material comes from. But it's much easier for you to have the document handy by going to the file link. In addition to the background information of a UN study in the introduction, the main body of this book provides practical activities that help children and young people to understand issues of violence in different settings and promote youth actions against violence. The last example is concerned with this year's theme of International Youth Day, engaging young people in the global campaign for right to environment. For this one, we don't have any downloadable material on this page, but instead, let's explore the interactive platform together. It is actually a communications toolkit that seeks to raise awareness of environmental literacy and advocate incorporating climate education into school curriculum. These materials look very user-friendly, including key messaging, letter templates, hashtags, and very cool graphics. You can simply use them to take actions like writing op-ed, posting on social media, or sending a note to your community. Going beyond the special collection to celebrate International Youth Day, please feel free to also search for any themes that best serve your needs for human rights education, training, or advocacy. For example, if you click on Right to Education, you will then have a customized collection of 70 resources with a clear focus on right to education. Under the same tab at the top of the home page, you can find a place to share your own resources with HREA's colleagues. To make the submission, all you need to do is to fill out this form, paying attention to these red marks, which are required information of your resources. You can either upload the document here or just provide a link to it. Finally, you just click on the Submit button to complete the process. With your submissions, we'll be able to keep updating and adding to HREA's online resource center. Thank you in advance for your contributions.
Thank you, Crystal, for that presentation on the Online Resource Center. We're wrapping up now, so let me just say on behalf of the HREA team here, how grateful we are that you, Phil, joined us today. and shared your amazing work in building capacities with and through youth. I can see in the chat box a number of people are interested to get in touch with you. I think that's a fantastic development already as a result of the webinar. Thanks also to the wonderful students, Annie, Josh, and Suni, who shared your experiences and views, who prepared questions for us. It was fantastic to just to get to know you a little bit in this webinar, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, especially so late there for those of you who are in South Korea. My warm thanks to Crystal Wang on the HREA team for organizing this webinar. Fantastic work in doing this. Thank you, Crystal. And for Jessica and Serena's backup as well. It's been a joint effort. It's been a joy to work on this webinar. I want to thank everybody, you youth, you adults who are working in peace building, in peace, in human rights, collectively. Thank you for the fantastic work you're doing. And I hope that this webinar has enriched you. Certainly it's enriched me in thinking more about the ways that we can and should invite youth to take leadership on the issues of our times with our support and in solidarity. This has been recorded, so we're going to be making this webinar available on the HREA website. Our last request for you, for those who have another minute, is to take some time to give us a bit of feedback, if you can do that. Going back to the Jamboard, I think it's on page 3. We have a simple page set up for you to give us a little bit of feedback. We'd love to hear from you how the webinar went for you. We have people just joining us now, so now we know one thing is to make sure people check the time zones. Unfortunately, that's not been, it was some mistakes, I guess, and we could make that clearer perhaps, but please feel free to give us feedback, things you liked, things we could do better. And Serena, could you share, is it in the chat box there? The link to page 3, that would be great if you could share it. Here it is. So it's there in the chat box for you to share your feedback. Thanks, Serena. Thanks to all of you. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are. Keep up the wonderful work and happy International Youth Day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.